What we do here is not good enough to be considered Greek-Australian culture, and it doesn't stand on its own.
When working class women write memoir, it's deemed a bit trivial.
The losers of the Civil War, and that were the communists. Those were the communists.
And even elderly Greek women are starting to become empowered.
And as a Greek girl, I thought, why is a non-Greek writing about such an intimate topic?
The Greek communities in Australia were divided along the lines of the Civil War in the 40s and the 50s.
Γεια σας and welcome back to Think Greek. I'm Kalliakoudis Gold, and with my guests tonight here at the Commons in the heart of Melbourne's Greek Quarter, we are exploring Greek migration in Australia. Let's go to our guests.
Of course, during that time, if you're a communist in Greece, it was difficult to get paperwork to come to Australia. We hear of stories of forgery to be able to leave because you were deemed to be left-wing.
That's very true, very true. I know a case, a dear friend of mine, he passed away a few years ago, where the whole village wanted to get rid of him, so they managed to get the right papers to kick the communists out. That's basically what happened. See? But Greeks started becoming members of the Australian Communist Party since the 1920s. A couple of them perhaps were founding members in 1920. Okay? And they became active within the Greek community. Of course, they were internationalists, they believed in working class politics, but they also found that within the CP there was no discrimination. So the Communist Party of Australia becomes the only political space where indigenous Australians are recognized slowly and where ethnic migrants, Greeks and Italians mainly, are, so to speak, welcomed. So Greeks become members of the Communist Party and active within the Greek communities. That's how the citizen discourse begins. They were persecuted within the Greek communities, and there are two very tragic examples. One is Dimitris Mitsopoulos. He was distributing anti-war leaflets in 1939-1940, and usually what Michael Chounis calls the Greek establishment, the leaders, the consul, the Greek newspapers, would inform the authorities. He was caught, and he was put in prison for a number of months. His comrade, Andreas Raftopoulos, becomes the first trade union official and tries to unionize Greek workers in the Greek cafes. The whole Greek community turned against him, and ultimately he committed suicide. And recently we found his grave after 80 years. Anyway, so there are Greek communists. They become stronger in the 1940s. They become very influential in the Greek communities through organizations like the Greek Democratist League. In the 1940s, we have the first, if you like, Greek-Australian feminist voices, to go back to because women were totally invisible.
Totally.
The then secretary of Demokritos Kikitsuni and her sister Tula, they complain, they write articles that, where are the women? They criticize the comrades for, those kinds of things. And then we have the tragedy of the Civil War, and I can fully appreciate what you're saying. I've met people who participated, they came to Australia, some of them became politically active. They were persecuted by the Greek community, but they were at the forefront of developing, if you like, the political discourse of integrity. Of integrity. They played a huge role. The Greek communities in Australia were divided along the lines of the Civil War in the 40s and the 50s.
And they were dobbing each other in. I want to talk briefly about two topics, because you said that you were going to talk about whether the Greek community is being kind to gays, which we barely touched, women, but also children. And children are the voice that we don't hear. The voice of children growing up here as migrants or growing up as children of migrants. And we have in Brisbane, on one of the bridges, a monument dedicated to Hector Vassiliou, who was a young boy in 1917, welcoming the soldiers that were coming back home from the First World War, ran out into the streets of Brisbane to welcome them, got run over by a truck. So we have actually a physical monument to one of the early Greek Australian children who were here, and their experiences. We never hear about them. So that's just a side point. Number two, on the topic of women, and touching on something that was said earlier, that is the Greek migration story, the story of winners that we hear all the time. Women were very vulnerable. As a lawyer, one of the cases that we studied in criminal law was R.V. Papadimitropoulos, And Mr. Papadimitriopoulos was a man who would go and target women, and as they came off the boats, said, "I'll marry you. If you're looking for a husband, I'll marry you." Had a friend perform a sham civil ceremony and would sleep with them, and created a legal precedent because at the time the woman basically found out that this was a sham marriage and claimed that this was a rape based on the fact that she didn't consent to the act, because her idea was, if I knew he wasn't my husband, I wouldn't have consented. At the time, it was found that it wasn't rape, but since then that's been revised. So there are legal precedents for Greek males, migrants, preying on Greek women within the community and using their ignorance, their vulnerability for their own gratification and committing crimes. We've actually made legal history in this case. And there are countless accounts of women who either fell pregnant because they were vulnerable here and were outcast from the Greek community, or their husbands left them when they got here, and as a divorced woman, you could not be within the Greek community, and they were cast out. And these are stories that we don't tell, and I think we need to tell them.
I have to state that a lot of the stories talk about incidents exactly like that. The lace tablecloth is an absolutely beautiful story, not particularly well disseminated in the Greek community. It's available in Greek and English, and it's about exactly that. A young girl who comes, she's a promised bride, she gets raped and abandoned, and on it goes. I cannot tell you how many stories I have in my archive that delineate all these sorts of things. And the reason they were kept very quiet, because the women themselves felt shame. And it's only now that they're starting to become, because of, I know it might sound like a populist movement, but things like Me Too and so on, and even elderly Greek women are starting to become empowered. I've just translated a book, and it's written by a 92-year-old woman who talks about her rape as a little girl, being sexually abused, and it took now for her to have the courage to say that, and the abuse she suffered when she first came to Melbourne and the conservative society here. These experiences do exist in our stories, but they're books that have been just put to the side. And it's only whether we like it or not. I know it'd be lovely if all our children spoke Greek, of course, but whether we like it or not, the third generation, fourth generations feel more comfortable in English, speaking and reading in English. And so I'm a great believer in the imperative of translation into English of these stories to facilitate their dissemination.
One of the most amazing cases that I handled was a young Greek woman who had come here at the age of 17 in the early 60s, who ended up in Sydney, and she got pregnant on the ship over, and she went to a Sydney public hospital, had the child, and was told the child was stillborn. Yeah. So she moved on. And I was actually handling a case for her many years later in the 80s. And for some reason, she had to go back to this Sydney hospital for another medical problem she had. And she went to admissions, and the woman said, "Have you ever been to this hospital before?" And she said, "Yes, I have. I came here as a 17-year-old in the early 60s, and I had a stillborn child." And the woman's, now everything's computerised, looking on the computer, she said, "Stillborn? No, the child wasn't stillborn. It was put up for adoption. You consented to adoption." So she races back to our office, tells us this amazing thing. I didn't know what to make of it. Freedom of information, get the file from the hospital. There's an affidavit. Now, this woman has only been here a few months. There's an affidavit, no interpreter's clause, purportedly signed by my client, consenting to the child being adopted. It took a very long time, but we tracked the child down. She didn't even know that she was adopted. It became a class action because she was not the only woman that was targeted through this unethical doctor who had taken these children away from these women, these Greek women, and had given them for payment of money to other families.
I think in terms of the recognition of women and the role that they have played in the history of our community, one can say that the history that's been if not written, certainly written and controlled largely by men, hasn't been kind to the role of women, to their input and to their own experiences. We as women, or our mother's generation or grandmother's generation, previously have not earned their rightful place, and the part that they've played in this whole migration story. And therefore, I'm emboldened and also hopeful that the next generation that I spoke about, my children's generation, will take that, and they will be kinder, and they will, I believe, kinder in the sense that they will elevate to their rightful place the contribution, the trials, the tribulations, the sadness, those stories which need to be told. Are we, as a formal community, in terms of its leadership as it lines up, is it kind to women? No, it's not, because women have not and do not exist in that lineup of the leadership of the community in whatever form it is. There is a formal leadership. And I have found that my generation, my age group, tend to be almost worse in a way in terms of the promotion and encouragement of the women than the first generation were. You can understand the first generation because they come from an experience that was different, and all of these experiences happened at a time when things were different for everybody, not just the Greek community, not just Greek women, but women generally. You expect more. I expected more as someone who's in Parliament and thinks about these things and deals with them quite a bit, with other communities as well. I expected our community to have progressed a lot more in 2022. It hasn't, so we have a long way to go. And again, it may be the role of the next generation or the present younger generation to actually take on that challenge and do something about it.
George, can we talk about the NIFES?
If we look at the Greek newspapers since they started being published in the 1910s, up until today, there is no really concept, let alone practice, of investigative journalism. Such a thing does not exist. Okay? The organized communities, and I'm emphasizing this, with the institutions, are mechanisms that create and hide problems. Okay? With women, with the elderly, with children, with people with sexuality. I know some horrible stories through my work because students of Greek origin would come to my subjects, they would say I'm Greek, they would talk to me, terrible stories, but this is something different. With NIFES, it's not something that I can speak about authoritatively, so to say, But
there were many stories, George. There were many stories. The stoicism of women who came here as promised brides is quite extraordinary, and something I have just the most unstinting admiration for. Many came and actually met the man for the first time at the ship and went on to have happy marriages. Yeah. And again, this is through the literature. And they say he was lovely, he was kind, and we had a good marriage. Others just endured it. There are many, many stories. One story again, so many heartbreaking stories, again in the literature. This was part of a memoir that I translated many years ago, where a girl came here. She was the most beautiful girl on the ship. She came, she walked off, married a man who was in his 40s. He would beat her every single day to the point where she actually was incarcerated in an institution. These are, it's a whole phasm of stories. There are all sorts of stories in relation to the girls who came here.
For the people that may not know, women would travel to Australia to get married, and they would come just with a picture or sometimes just with a name.
The same thing is happening with the new and emerging communities, exactly the same. So there are patterns here. So to go back to your question about kindness, in that context, we weren't kind to women, but then women didn't have that kindness attributed to them generally because of the time as well.
It's very important to understand also, the Greeks are very topikistes. We're not talking about brides just across the board. it's από τον τόπο σου. This is very important to understand that because the brides we see that went to America, for example, that came from the Sydney and the Asia Minor coastline or pre-genocide, for example, they went as generally brides in regards to the Greeks in America, obviously the single men who went to work and then they wanted to marry. The Greeks here were predominantly topikistes. So the brides they would bring, my father was Kefalonian, he met my uncle, they become sort of buddies, and all of a sudden, I've got a sister, yep, done, let's do it. My father probably was a bit short, sent a probably different photo, a taller man, for argument's sake, for my mum. She came off the boat, and that was it, and she did it.
You're smiling, so it all worked out.
Well, obviously got the height, yeah. Got from my mother's side, but yeah.
My sister's older than me. She's a lawyer as well. So I was working for her as a 17-year-old when the Family Law Act came into operation in 1974. Before the Family Law Act, there was what's called the Matrimonial Causes Act, and that's exactly what it said. To be able to get a divorce, you had to have a reason. Desertion, adultery, things like that. Now, I can tell you that as a female Greek lawyer, for the next 5 years, women would be coming, dozens of women would be coming into my sister's office because there was no fault. To a T, most of them had been abused, just about all of them, but they didn't want to make those allegations. Whenever they went to the police, they wouldn't listen. Whenever they spoke to their brothers or sisters or whatever, they didn't want to listen. Θα μένεις με τον άντρα σου και τα παιδιά σου. As soon as the act came in and all they needed was 1 year's separation, they were pouring in. But most of them was because of abuse. Anecdotally, of course, but it must have been extremely prevalent in the 60s and the 70s for Greek men to abuse their wives. I'm still practicing. I don't do a lot of family law, but it's changed considerably. Most of the time now it is people just move on or they've got someone else in their lives. But yes, it does happen, but most men are now fearful of bashing their wives. It's not as prevalent because they get punished by the law, right? The law will punish them. They'll get orders. Yes, it is. It does happen, but not as prevalent.
It's very high. And maybe it's because awareness is much greater. But I can tell you that in the emerging communities, domestic violence is a major issue, and it's almost reminiscent of what might have been happening in the 60s. It's that cultural attitude, the woman's place. A lot of it is tied into dowries, it's tied into the immigration system. I mean, it's a huge problem. Nevertheless, it may have ceased in the Greek and other established communities, but that's because women of my generation and onwards are a lot, a lot more empowered, and the dynamics have changed considerably. So it's still a major issue. I mean, if you look at the statistics, and I look at my electorate, we've got a very high level of domestic violence in both existing and newer communities, and it has become a major issue of our times. It is one of those issues. There's a couple of issues of our time, and that is one of them. And a lot of that's got to do with attitudes and cultural practices that need to change. And this goes to the core of the history of integration of migrants as opposed to assimilation post the 70s, the Whitlam years and the Fraser years. The word assimilate, no one talks about you need to be assimilated anymore. Certainly when I was growing up in the 60s, assimilation was the word. We didn't really know what we were going to assimilate into. So the Greek identity was who we were, because I don't remember knowing what an Australian identity was. It was just someone else that was different, and they had been here longer than we were, and they set the rules. But we found safety in our own identity as it was created for us, so that then we could develop a sense of empowerment of self and who we were.
Part of the text was The Young Wife, written by David Martin. Do you remember? And as a Greek girl, I thought, why is a non-Greek writing about such an intimate topic? It was about she was a Niffy who came off the boat and was abused during a marriage, and it became part of the syllabus of my Anglo-Saxon education, but written by an Anglo-Saxon.
The reason that was, it's because an Anglo-Australian writer would be published. and a Greek writer would not. Yannis Vassilakakos, for example, wrote a very successful play. It wasn't through a mainstream publisher. And one of the things that you remind me of, you're an actress, aren't you? Yeah, because I was going to say, in the 80s, I was an actress as well before I became an academic. And I performed for many years with Tess Lysiotis. And that absolutely triggered a revolution, because suddenly Tess claimed the right to tell our stories and claimed the right to put them on an Australian stage. One of the comments that I make in my research is that, to be honest, where Greek women and their stories are concerned, patriarchy and patriarchal constriction was more horrific than racism was. In the early years here, in the 50s, 60s and 70s, that was worse. And it comes back to your what you said before, that in fact they were things that were brought with them. They were part of this patriarchal constriction. And one of the most heartening things I've ever read and translated was a collection of stories by a Greek-Australian male writer. He's a man, Nikos Piperis. He's in his nearly 80s now, and he wrote, the way he presents his stories, he maintains that patriarchy actually serves nobody. It actually is detrimental to men, it's detrimental to minorities, and it's catastrophic for women.
The journey never ends. Stay with us for more Think Greek next week.
We wasted most of our history fighting over who's going to run churches.
I didn't know that I was an Australian till I got to Greece, where I was the foreigner.
A lot of us Greeks became educated because of Gough Whitlam. He educated our community.